Will Sherwood is a PhD candidate at the University of Glasgow, researching the intersections of Tolkien's Middle-earth and Romanticism. He is the Education Secretary for the Tolkien Society, co-editor of The Romantic Spirit in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and has published reviews and articles in the Journal of Tolkien Research. His research interests include Romantic literature and its legacies, environmental humanities, and speculative philosophy and literature. Give a hand for Will.
Thank you one and all for staying for this paper. I strategically put myself last, so everyone else gets the spotlight yet again. It's all about you, not me. But Elena, thank you very much for that introduction. So the title is strategically vague, so that I could choose a particular part of the PhD that I thought would kind of blend well with the program and add a little bit more and also be exciting. So there's a couple of kind of connections with earlier papers. So Leah's paper looking at that kind of romantic author figure. It's going to be a little bit of blending in that. We've got some of Shelley's defense of poetry, which is going to feature as well. So let's dig in. My aim for today is to examine how Tolkien theorizes authorship in relation to the theories produced by British Romantic period authors. It will touch on the misogynistic formulation of the male romantic genius by male authors and the period's publishing industry, patriarchal Victorian constructions and canonizations of Romanticism, and the Victorians' reverence for male writers. This is a very male construction in the 19th century and continuing into the 20th. So as I am dealing specifically with romantic authorship as it was canonized by the Victorians and inherited by Tolkien's generation, I will only be engaging with male-centric theories in this paper. However, it is critical to address the importance of comparative work on Tolkien and female romantics, as Eva Lippold has expertly showcased in her chapter in The Romantic Spirit in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. It is a superb paper. It was pretty much finished in its first draft. Superb paper. I'd really recommend reading it. So I will specifically be considering how Tolkien subsumes and rejects differing dimensions of romantic authorship and how these ideas are expressed in letters, interviews, the lecture English and Welsh, and the two poems, The Horns of Ymir and Mythopoeia. So romantic authors such as William Blake, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Percy Bysshe Shelley, John Keats, and Lord Byron, the Big Six as they were known in the latter half of the 20th century, all theorized what it meant to be an author within the works themselves. Several of these ideas also overlapped and influenced one another, as is the case with Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, which has got his theory on the imagination that Tolkien strongly responds to, Wordsworth's preface to the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads, and Shelley's A Defense of Poetry. The Romantic author was fictionalized as a solitary male genius who, detached from the rest of humanity, was able to philosophize through poetry, perceive and conjure realities beyond the intellect and imaginations of the readers, and voice eternal truths through their participation with the divine. That words appeared quite a lot today, and I think there's a particular reason for that. Tim was talking as well about this transcendental dimension of Romanticism, which is there. So these romantic manifestos fictionalize and cultivated images of their writers as producers of original art. Paradoxical fallacy fabricated as a superior artistic model to the perceived lifeless mimesis of Augustan poetics, exhibited in the works of writers like John Dryden and Alexander Pope. Now, as Andrew Bennett illustrates, the Romantic author is ultimately seen as different from humanity itself. He, note the pronoun, is seen as both an exemplary human and somehow above and beyond the human, as literally and figuratively outstanding. He is, after all, ahead of his time. Avant-garde. If you took away that title, you could literally think, oh, who is this about Tolkien? Like, who are we talking about here? Like, there is a kind of automatic connection, like, yeah, we kind of talk about Tolkien as if he's ahead of his time. I wonder why. So originality and being ahead of the time were defensive maneuvers implemented to offset anxieties produced by a lack of sales and readership in the Romantic period. Matthew Sangster, one of my supervisors, addresses this point acutely, offering a sober reminder that of the canonized Big Six, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley, and Blake sold very few copies of their writing. Only Byron achieved popularity and high sales margins. You've got that quote, I awoke and found myself famous after the publication of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, Cantos 1 and 2, along with Scott, who's one of the big sellers of the day. So Sangster is right in outlining that 5 of the 6 major romantics achieved their prominence due to the processes of canonization that they set in motion through incorporating self-justificatory theories into their works. So the works themselves created the mythology of who these writers were. So in addition to Sangster's picture of the Romantic author as someone who theorizes how future readers should understand their poetry, Bennett's defining study, this is an excellent book, Romantic Poets and the Culture of Posterity, postulates that Romantic poetry begins to be understood as not only recording the life, but actually constructing the life. Poetry appears to produce the writer's identity. It fictionalizes, it mythologizes the writer as they wish to be seen. Something that Tolkien does actually do, which I'm going to come to in a bit. So, as is the case with the likes of Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Byron, poetry became the vehicle to immortalize a certain persona they desired posterity to revere, specifically the Victorians. Tolkien specifically transplants this method into his interviews and his letters, which I'll look at shortly. But combined, the theoretical and the autobiographical components meant that the male romantic myth of the genius author rose to obscure the reality of the literary marketplace. So the fiction overtook the reality in this instance, transcending the very entity that initially established the author's position in society. Now, David Higgins has highlighted how the term genius was instrumentalized to elevate male authors, while female authors could only be labeled genius if they confined quote, confined themselves to sentimental subjects. You could only be a genius if you talked about a sentimental subject and you were a woman. Otherwise, you're not a genius. That's my field. Stay away. Literally happened. So it reinforces this patriarchal socio-cultural restriction of female autonomy within the publishing industry. You think about like the Bronte sisters, for example, who had to publish under male pseudonyms. Like there is that kind of tendency of yearning for a place in the industry, and males only really having that strong sense. But the big picture is bigger. I'm just generalizing a bit. So it's precisely these gendered, self-constructed models of authorship that guided early patriarchal Victorian remediations and the canonizations of a predominantly masculine romanticism. There's the quote. As Higgins astutely notes, once the idea of the transcendent author had taken hold, it was to prove impossible to get rid of. There's a viscousness to this idea in culture, and even Tolkien succumbed to it. Whether he knew it or not doesn't matter. The tradition and the culture is there. The nexus of this cultural construction was Wordsworth. Don't think that should surprise anyone, whose influence on the formation of Romanticism and the Victorians who constructed Romanticism, such as like John Newman, the guy who literally created the Birmingham Oratory that Tolkien grew up as a Catholic in. for one connection and parallel. These people made Wordsworth the keystone. They looked up to and revered. They deified, I think is not too strong a word, Wordsworth, so much that H.J. Jackson has termed it, quote, a Wordsworthian cult. And I think she's right to say such. This perspective is reaffirmed by Tolkien's own education, as during his final undergraduate examinations at the University of Oxford, one of the two questions that pertain to Romanticism literally asked the students to discuss Wordsworth's influence on his contemporaries. Again, Wordsworth's in the middle, you're all peripheral. So, turning to Tolkien, finally, although we commonly think of Tolkien's authorship as collaborative, a strand I will explore a little bit later, his interviews and letters betray his tendency to unleash the inner romantic. Dimitri Fimi has, my other supervisor, just throwing that out there, has also reminded us that Tolkien consciously fed the hunger for mythological biographical details to the point where Tolkien himself believed some of the fictions. You think about, the languages were, the mythology was created to give a history to the languages. That's something that Tolkien perpetuated, but through Dimitri's a phenomenal book, she literally shows that that wasn't the case, that they grew side by side. So it's a myth that Tolkien perpetuated later in his life that is wrong, simply. But again, it's kind of this Wordsworthian link into it. So according to Femi, Tolkien had a desire to control information by guiding research in specific directions, specifically through his interviews and his letters. So we get these two examples. I can't deal with all of them, but I do not know why they should research The Lord of the Rings without any reference to me. After all, I hold the key. Literally calling himself a gatekeeper there. And then in letter 188 to Alan and Unwin, it is, however, intelligible for an author, while still alive, should feel a deep and immediate concern in translation. And this one is, unfortunately, also a professional linguist, a pedantic don who has wide personal connections and friendships with the chief English scholars of the continent. The translation of Lord of the Rings will prove a formidable task, and I do not see how it can be performed satisfactorily without the assistance of the author. Basically, don't translate it unless I have a hand in it. So other examples include his theory of inherent linguistic predilection, its relevance to the framing of his early legendarium, not the Silmarillion, as an English mythology, letter 133 to Milton Waldman, which I will rip apart in my PhD, and also the foreword to The Lord of the Rings. But collectively, all of these illustrate Tolkien embodying a romantic conception of the authors as the genius authority. He is the authority on his text. You must go through him to understand his text. And he also asserts his linguistic profession as the dominant credential that, to his mind, should grant him control of his biography and his writings' legacies. So Tolkien figuratively positions himself as the gatekeeper of his work. To access its deeper meaning, the reader must consult the author. Just as the Romantics used their writing to control their legacies, Tolkien too framed and directed how generations of readers have engaged with his mythology. Even today, his romantic mythologizing of his biography and legendarium affects how we still talk about him. You just got to look at the heated debates on Amazon's The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. If you haven't, I have. Thank you. I have no trauma from that experience. So, as many scholars have noted, Tolkien frequently changed his mind. There is no one fixed picture. He was a human being. He was capricious. All of the drafts indicate that he constantly was changing his mind on things. So it's clear that he disagreed with the model of the author as a solitary entity. And he also really didn't like Wordsworth's biographical poetry. And that kind of aligns him with Keats. Keats wasn't a massive fan of this idea of what he calls the egotistical sublime of Wordsworth's poetry. The I in the poem, I stand on the mountain looking out. I look at the daffodils and it affects me. Like they just want to throw up. They really don't like it. So, but also, furthermore, Tolkien actually relied very heavily on literary groups such as the TTBS and Inklings, which harkens to his conception of authorship as a predominantly collaborative undertaking. So, although Wordsworth framed himself as an independent writer, this is not the case for many of his contemporaries. Neither should we allow his model of authorship to dictate how we talk about Romanticism as a whole, especially British Romanticism. There are one or two parallels between James Macpherson that we've heard about earlier, Blake, Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats and Tolkien that I'm going to just briefly touch on in opposition to Wordsworth. So Tolkien's On Fairy Story espouses a vision of authorship as divine derivation, which owes something to the Romantic author as it was formulated during the Romantic period. So for Blake, these are probably four of his most famous lines. I'm starting to run out of time, so I'm not going to read everything out. You should be like, oh, yes, I know that line straight away. But to Blake, the poet alone has the power to comprehend and explore spatial and temporal realities that are inaccessible to other humans. Similarly, Coleridge explores the supernatural capabilities of the poet with their synthetic and magical power. Shelley additionally contests that a poet participates in the divine nature as regard providence no less than as creation. And that's a spirituality that is not a Christian divinity. He was an atheist. He was kicked out of Oxford for being an atheist, literally. Not even joking about that. Tick, tick, tick. So to be an author is to enter into another dimension, to be able to access it, to attune with it and harmonize it with our own. And Timothy Morton's postulated that for Shelley, this meant sentience is attunement. Quite a neat idea that I think really works, not just for Shelley, but with these other Romantic poets. So various Romantic authors I've mentioned thus far attach the imagination and metaphysical to the symbol of the Aeolian harp. So, okay, it's okay. You're excited. That's fine. So Shelley perhaps most famously declared this in the defense of poetry, that man is an instrument over which a series of external and internal impressions are derived, like the alternations of an ever-changing wind over an Aeolian lyre, harp. Which move it by their motion to ever-changing melody. But here, the image of the author as a solitary figure, it starts to collapse, and I think Morton is kind of implying this. So informed by their external and internal impressions, the Aeolian harp aids the author in constructing a symbiotic relationship with the broader cultural environment in which they operate. So I emphasize this as it becomes apparent that Romantic authors were sensitive to their place within the historical traditions in which they wrote. It wasn't a case of, I am external, I am the genius. Lots of them actually knew about their position, and although it's got problems, Harold Bloom's was it the anxiety book? I've forgotten the title of it. Can you remember? Thank you so much. The Anxiety of Influence. It's literally about the Romantic poets thinking about their place within a historical literary tradition. Oh goodness, I've lost my place. Right. So am I going in the right place? Yeah, okay, let's go with this. So James Macpherson helped to popularize specifically the place of the Aeolian harp. So Ossian always has his harp. He's blind, he has his harp to create this song and continue with this. So in the Ossianic cycle, he has this quote, and then comes a voice to Ossian and awakes his soul. It is the voice of years that are gone. They roll before me with all their deeds. I seize the tales as they pass and pour them forth in song. Now, to me, that screams Tolkien. Like when I first read this, I was like, I need to get this in a work in some way, shape, or form. I think it's an epigraph somewhere. But this is also alongside Shelley. Yeah, so alongside Shelley and Keats. So Keats employs it in the Ode to Apollo. He literally creates and invokes a pantheon of his own poetic ancestors. So by returning to the original Romantic material, the canonized image of the Romantic author as a secluded genius who produces original art, it actually kind of starts to sound out of place. Like it doesn't make sense with all of these other theories that are being created within the works, going back to what Matthew Sangster was saying about the self-justificatory theories within the poetry. Macpherson, Shelley, and Keats indicated that they consciously worked in dialogue with past authors and voices, a notion that Tolkien was highly sympathetic to. Yes, there is some sense of divine derivation for Tolkien, but what is just as central is his cultural engagement with the past authors. Beowulf poet, the Pearl poet, Ariel, Elfwine, Heronda, Elendil, Bilbo, Frodo, Sam, and Findgil. Don't forget Findgil. If you don't know who Findgil is, read the prologue to The Lord of the Rings, specifically the last 2 paragraphs. So in Tolkien's scholarship, as much as in his fiction, he saw himself as a collaborator who, like these 3 on the screen, embodies Frodo's revelation. No, the great tales never end as tales, but the people in them come and go when their parts ended. Our part will end later or sooner. There's actually a romantic sense to Frodo's musings here. And Tolkien utilizes the romantic symbolism of the Aeolian harp. So I've picked out these 3 examples so far. There will probably be more. Ting Fang Warble, unfortunately, is not one. He is a flautist. I was devastated to find that out. Moving downwards. So for Tuor in the Horns of Ymir, the Aeolian harp is a tool to not only fictionalize and insert himself into a living body of stories, but to also build on an existing mythology pertaining to the Valar and Beleriand. In Mythopoeia, his second poem that I've quoted, Tolkien evokes a sense of a narratorial deep time, with a pantheon of faceless authors. So much like Keats's pantheon in Ode to Apollo, he wants to be working with these faceless authors that time has forgotten. That idea of deep time is beyond what we have. That's that quote there. So not found within recorded time. That's the bit that I'm on about, which has constructed the foundations of the culture and literature that means the most to Tolkien. So that's what he's trying to get at. So he desires to be a part of their legacy by rekindling or developing their tales in new forms. So English and Welsh also reinforces this symbolism as the Aeolian harp becomes the very catalyst which is sparked by language to reconnect Tolkien with what he perceives as home, or should we say his origins rather than home. So concluding, as David Higgins and Matthew Sangster encourage, by returning to romantic texts, we can critically engage with the myths that have been cemented by centuries of retellings. The presence of various romantic theories of authorship throughout Tolkien's corpus testifies that although a Wordsworthian model of authorship did inform his own self-mythologizing in his interviews and letters, he did not religiously adhere to one ideology. Scholars have commonly attributed Tolkien's collaborative model of authorship to his work with medieval texts. Makes sense. But his consistent implementation of the Aeolian harp indicates that his ideas on the role of the author were also indirectly shaped by diverse strands of Romanticism that were prevalent in 20th century British literature and culture. Even 51 years after his passing, Tolkien's harnessing of distinctly romantic models of authorship continue to inform how his fans and readers mythologize his life and works. Moreover, these authorial and fan activities demonstrate that Romanticisms and Tolkien's legacies have become intertwined, informing the cultural existence of one another in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Well, we'll look for online questions. Are there any questions in the room? Oh, wonderful.
Hello, Will. I'll try to keep it short because I would have many questions, as you can imagine. Thank you so much for an interesting, fascinating talk. I have two comments and one question. One, I don't know if you read Friedrich Schiller's book from, I think it's from 1800, where he talks about the sentimental and naive poet. I don't know if you read it, but that would perhaps be an interesting comparison, talking about the gender stereotypes with the sentimental part. The second comment is, I don't know if you've also compared, when you had Ossian as an example, I also think the passage in Bede's historical chronicle about Ketman, the Old English poet who also received a voice from God and suddenly becomes, I also think that could also be, as you probably also know, an inspiration. But my question is regarding, I totally buy that this self-description and self-fashioning of Tolkien is quite strong. I was wondering what you think about, because I read recently that Tolkien also, despite saying, as you also mentioned, claiming himself to be a gatekeeper, I think he was also quite critical of people trying to do, source research on his own work, like pinpointing, oh, this is a reference to this and this medieval book. I was wondering if you think that is also a part of the same coin, or, another example of him sort of, no, listen to me, instead of listening to the sources that I use, or using them as, conclusions to my work. I was just wondering if you have an opinion on that. Thank you.
Always. Yeah, that's a great question, and also let's email, and our research is connected. So yeah, we'll talk. The question's a really good one, and I think there's certainly parts that plays in it. That sense of, I don't want people looking at specific, or kind of like, this reminds me of Keats. No, don't look at Keats. Go and look at Francis Thompson instead. Like, there are ways that he tries to control how people read him. And I think, and Andy's PhD has looked into Francis Thompson and the connections there. It's a great PhD. I'd really recommend anyone reading it. But I think Tom Shippey might have kind of commented on this a little bit, but it was a while since I've read any of his work. But I think when it comes to this, what I'm trying to establish is that he doesn't have one, it's not just the collaborative authorship. Like, similar with the Romantics, it's not just the solitary genius. There's so many facets and dimensions to his thinking that continuously fluctuated and changed. But I would certainly say that informed how he saw the role of the author. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, Will. It was a great talk.
Thank you.
I have a weird question.
Oh, go for it.
So you were talking about Ossian.
Yeah.
Who of course we all know was fake. It's kind of interesting because when Tolkien's alive, everybody knows he's fake. And Blake learns he's fake and is like, I don't care. He and Rowley he and Chatterton are amazing. I don't care if he's fake. I was wondering if whether he was fake, like, worried Tolkien, or if he was just like, nah.
Okay, I have spoken specifically on this. So on my master's thesis, which then turned into my Tolkien and the Age of Forgery article, I do specifically mention that so Tolkien consistently uses the word phony. There's quite a few times when Macpherson and Ossian are mentioned in various Tolkien texts throughout his life. Similar with Keats, like, they keep popping up. But he always uses the word phony as like, okay, that's got specific, meaning and power to it. But when when he learned about Macpherson at Oxford. So in that article, I do publish the two folios from his undergraduate notebooks where he's talking about Ossian, and he mentions J.S. Smart's book on Macpherson. Boney appears in there. So I don't know if he read J.F. Smart, but I think, you know, in those formative years, he kind of takes on this idea of, yeah, it's phony. It wasn't really based on this existing material, so I'm not going to pay attention to it as much, or at least that's what he tells us. I'm going to go over to the Kalevala instead, because that was definitely based on the material of like real material. So that's kind of the framing of what it is. I just think there's loads of correlations, and there's nothing wrong with looking at those correlations. But yeah, great question, and we'll talk more.